On a warm Sunday morning in June 1914, the future of Europe was riding through the streets of a provincial city in an open car. There were no tanks, no trenches, no thunder of artillery yet. Just sunlight, applause, and a quiet sense that history was asleep. By the end of the day, 4 gunshots would tear that sleep apart and set an entire continent on a path toward catastrophe. Europe in 1914 looked calm on the surface.
Trains ran on time.
Cafés were full. Diplomats traded pleasantries. Empires stretched confidently across maps, their borders colored in proud reds, blues, and yellows. But beneath that calm was pressure.
National pride rubbed against imperial control.
Old rivalries hardened into military plans. Alliances were signed like insurance policies, never meant to be used but ready all the same. No one yet called it a powder keg.
But it was.
At the center of this fragile calm stood the Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was not a beloved figure. He was blunt, impatient, and deeply skeptical of the empire he was expected to rule. Yet he carried authority, and more importantly, symbolism. To many, he represented continuity. To others, especially in the Balkans, he represented domination. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand arrived in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, a region recently absorbed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The date itself was loaded with meaning. June 28, known as Vidovdan, was sacred in Serbian history, a day tied to medieval defeat and national identity. To many Slavs, the Archduke's visit felt less like diplomacy and more like a provocation. But the morning began calmly. Franz Ferdinand rode beside his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg. This alone was unusual. Sophie was not of royal blood, and court protocol often kept her away from official events. Yet in Sarajevo, she was allowed to sit beside him, smiling, relaxed, unaware that this would be one of the few moments she would ever be publicly acknowledged as his equal. Their motorcade moved slowly through the city. The route had been published in advance. Crowds lined the streets.
Flags waved.
Children ran alongside the cars. And scattered among the crowd were young men who believed history could be changed by force. They were students, nationalists, idealists. Some were barely out of their teens. They carried pistols, grenades, and cyanide capsules. They were linked to a shadowy network of Serbian nationalist groups, some with ties to elements inside Serbia's military intelligence. Their goal was simple and reckless: kill the heir to the empire and ignite a revolution. The first assassin lost his nerve. The second hesitated. Then, as the Archduke's car passed along the Appel Quay, a bomb was thrown. It bounced off the folded roof of the vehicle and exploded under the next car in the procession. The blast wounded several officers and bystanders.
Smoke filled the street. Chaos erupted.
Franz Ferdinand was unharmed. Instead of fleeing the city, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He insisted on continuing the visit, altering the route so he could visit the wounded in hospital. It was a gesture of duty. It was also a fatal mistake. No one clearly informed the driver of the change. As the car turned down a side street, the engine stalled directly in front of a delicatessen. Standing just a few feet away was Gavrilo Princip. Princip was 19 years old.
Thin. Tubercular.
Radicalized by ideas larger than his life. He had failed earlier in the day and believed his chance was gone. Now, suddenly, history was idling in front of him. He stepped forward and fired 2 shots.
One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. The other hit Sophie in the abdomen.
Witnesses later recalled how she collapsed into her husband's lap. He reportedly whispered to her, "Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." Within minutes, both were dead.
The street fell silent.
Those shots echoed far beyond Sarajevo. But at first, Europe barely reacted. In Vienna, the news was received without hysteria. Franz Ferdinand had not been popular. Some officials privately saw his death as politically convenient. Newspapers covered the event, but few predicted consequences beyond diplomatic tension. That misjudgment would prove fatal. What mattered was not only who was killed, but where and by whom. The Austro-Hungarian leadership saw the assassination not as an isolated act of terror, but as an attack on imperial authority, with Serbia standing behind it.
Evidence was thin. Suspicion was not.
Behind closed doors, generals and ministers argued that this was the moment to act. The empire had been humiliated too many times in the Balkans. If Serbia was not punished now, it never would be. But Austria-Hungary hesitated. The empire was old, slow, and divided. Its army was untested. Any action against Serbia risked intervention from Russia, protector of Slavic nations and longtime rival of Vienna. So Austria-Hungary did what great powers often do when unsure. It looked for reassurance. That reassurance came from Germany. In early July, Austrian officials traveled to Berlin. There, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors offered what historians later called the blank check. Germany promised full support for whatever action Austria-Hungary chose to take against Serbia. This promise was decisive. With German backing secured, Vienna drafted an ultimatum designed not to be accepted. It demanded that Serbia allow Austro-Hungarian officials to operate inside Serbian territory. It challenged Serbian sovereignty outright. On July 23, the ultimatum was delivered. Europe watched closely. Serbia responded with restraint. It accepted nearly every demand, rejecting only those that violated its constitution. Diplomats across Europe believed the response was reasonable. Some even thought war had been avoided. Austria-Hungary disagreed. On July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The first artillery shells fell on Belgrade the next day. What followed was not a sequence of careful decisions, but a collapse of restraint.
Alliance obligations activated like falling dominoes.
Russia mobilized to protect Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then France. German armies moved through Belgium, pulling Britain into the conflict. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Millions of men marched, believing the conflict would be short. Many thought they would be home by Christmas. They carried bright uniforms, old doctrines, and confidence built on previous wars that had never tested industrial power on this scale. None of them understood what they were walking into. The assassination in Sarajevo did not cause World War I on its own, but it removed the final excuse for peace. It gave governments permission to act on plans they had been preparing for years. It transformed tension into action, and rivalry into slaughter. A single act by a young man with a pistol became the spark that ignited a system already soaked in fuel. And once it started, there was no stopping it. In the weeks ahead, borders would vanish under artillery fire.
Cities would empty.
Empires would bleed. And a war meant to defend honor would become a machine that consumed an entire generation. But at the moment the shots were fired, none of that was visible.
There was only a quiet street in Sarajevo, a stopped car,
and 2 lives fading as history began to move. In the days after the assassination, Europe did not erupt.
It paused. Trains still ran. Markets stayed open.
Summer holidays continued. Diplomats exchanged condolences and formal notes. To the average citizen in Paris, Berlin, or London, Sarajevo felt distant, almost irrelevant. Assassinations had happened before. Empires had survived worse. What no one could see was that Europe had entered a narrow corridor of time where every decision mattered and almost every one would be wrong. Historians would later call it the July Crisis. At the time, it felt like routine statecraft. In Vienna, the death of Franz Ferdinand created a strange vacuum. The man who had been murdered was not loved, not even by the emperor himself. Emperor Franz Joseph, aging and weary, had buried a son, a wife, and now an heir. He mourned quietly, without public rage. But around him, younger men were impatient. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was fraying. Ethnic nationalism gnawed at its edges. Slavic populations in Bosnia, Croatia, and beyond looked toward Serbia as a symbol of resistance. To military leaders in Vienna, Serbia was not just a neighbor.
It was a disease.
The assassination offered clarity. Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf, a longtime advocate of war against Serbia, saw the moment he had been waiting for. He argued that hesitation would only encourage rebellion. The empire must strike now, decisively, before Serbia grew stronger. But Austria-Hungary could not act alone. Any war in the Balkans risked triggering Russia. And Russia, despite internal weakness, commanded massive manpower. A war against Russia would mean a war against its ally France. That would mean a continental conflict. The generals knew this. The politicians knew this. And still, they moved closer to war. The decision that tipped the balance came not in Vienna, but in Berlin. Germany in 1914 was powerful, confident, and anxious. It was surrounded by potential enemies. French resentment over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine had never faded. Russian military reforms threatened to make future war unwinnable if delayed too long. German leaders feared encirclement. When Austrian diplomats asked whether Germany would stand by them if Serbia and Russia became involved, Kaiser Wilhelm II answered without hesitation. Germany would support Austria-Hungary fully. This assurance, later remembered as reckless, was given casually. Wilhelm believed the crisis could be localized. He assumed Russia would back down, as it had before. He underestimated the emotional weight of Slavic nationalism and overestimated the ability of diplomacy to control events once armies began to move. With German backing secured, Austria-Hungary prepared its ultimatum. It was delivered to Serbia on the evening of July 23, 1914. The document was harsh by design. Serbia was given 48 hours to respond. Among its demands was a requirement that Austro-Hungarian officials participate directly in Serbian investigations and internal security. For any sovereign state, this was unacceptable. And yet, Serbia did something unexpected. Under pressure from Russia to avoid war if possible, the Serbian government accepted almost every demand. It rejected only those that violated its constitution. Its response was measured, almost submissive. Across Europe, diplomats breathed a brief sigh of relief. Austria-Hungary did not. To Vienna's leaders, Serbia's partial rejection was proof of guilt. The decision to go to war had already been made in spirit. The ultimatum had been a formality, not a negotiation. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Church bells rang in Vienna. In Belgrade, civilians fled as artillery shells began to fall across the Danube. It was the first bombardment of the war. The sound of gunfire echoed through streets that had seen violence before, but never on this scale. Still, the conflict might have remained regional.
It did not.
Russia now faced a choice that would define the century. To abandon Serbia would be to surrender its claim as protector of Slavic peoples and accept humiliation in the Balkans. To intervene risked war with Germany and Austria-Hungary, a war Russia was not fully prepared to fight. The Russian leadership hesitated. Tsar Nicholas II, personally timid and indecisive, exchanged telegrams with Kaiser Wilhelm II, both men addressing each other as cousins, both expressing hope for peace. But behind the scenes, mobilization plans were already moving. On July 30, Russia ordered general mobilization. In the military logic of 1914, mobilization was not a warning. It was an act of war. Germany reacted immediately. German war plans were rigid, shaped by the fear of a two-front conflict. The Schlieffen Plan, developed years earlier, assumed that if Russia mobilized, France would follow. Germany's only chance was to strike France first, quickly, before turning east. Diplomacy now raced against railway timetables. On August 1, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3, Germany declared war on France. To reach France quickly, German armies moved through neutral Belgium, violating its sovereignty. Britain, which had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, issued an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw. Germany ignored it. On August 4, Britain declared war. In less than 6 weeks, Europe had gone from peace to total war.
Crowds cheered in the streets.
Men volunteered in droves. Newspapers promised glory. Politicians spoke of honor and destiny. Few understood what modern war would actually mean. What followed was not heroic maneuver, but industrial slaughter. The opening battles shattered illusions. In the West, French troops advanced in bright uniforms, believing elan and courage could overcome firepower. They walked into machine gun fire and modern artillery. Casualties were catastrophic. German forces advanced rapidly at first, executing their timetable with ruthless precision. But resistance stiffened. Supply lines stretched. And near the River Marne, French and British forces halted the German advance in early September. The war of movement ended. What replaced it was something no one had planned for. Both sides dug in. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, trenches scarred the land. Soldiers lived underground like animals. Mud swallowed men and equipment.
Rats fed on corpses. Disease spread.
Shellfire never truly stopped. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a strip of death swept by machine guns and artillery. To cross it was often to die. Generals, still thinking in terms of 19th-century warfare, ordered frontal assaults. Thousands went over the top. Few came back. By the end of 1914, it was clear that the war would not be short. On the Eastern Front, the scale was even larger. Armies clashed across vast distances. Entire regions were depopulated. Civilians fled in panic. Ethnic violence erupted as suspicion and fear took hold. In the Balkans, Serbia initially resisted with ferocity, but the strain was unbearable. Typhus ravaged the population. The country bled itself dry. All of this had begun with a pistol in Sarajevo. Yet by now, the assassination itself was almost forgotten. What mattered was momentum. Once millions of men were mobilized, once factories were converted to weapons production, once national pride had been staked on victory, there was no easy way back. The war took on a life of its own. Governments censored news. Losses were hidden.
Hope was rationed.
Soldiers wrote letters home describing hell in careful, restrained language, trying not to frighten their families. Meanwhile, civilians learned to live with absence. Women replaced men in factories. Children grew up without fathers. Entire villages lost their young men in a single battle. By Christmas of 1914, the belief that the war would end quickly was gone. But on one quiet stretch of the front, something unexpected happened. On December 24, German soldiers began decorating their trenches with candles. They sang carols. British troops listened in disbelief. Then someone sang back. Men climbed out of trenches.
They met in no man's land.
They exchanged gifts. They buried their dead.
For a brief moment, the war stopped. It was spontaneous. It was fragile.
It horrified generals.
By morning, the killing resumed.
The Christmas truce would never happen again on that scale. The machinery of war was now fully engaged. What began as a punishment expedition had become a continental catastrophe. And as the months dragged on, it became clear that victory would require total commitment.
Industry, science, propaganda.
Entire societies would be reshaped to feed the front.
And still, no one could see an end.
The assassination that had shocked Europe had not simply triggered a war. It had exposed how brittle the international order truly was. How quickly reason gave way to fear. How alliances designed to preserve peace instead guaranteed destruction. By the end of 1914, Europe was locked in a struggle that would last 4 years and kill millions.
And the worst was still to come.
Because the war would not only destroy armies, it would destroy empires. By 1915, the illusion of control was gone. What had begun as a diplomatic crisis, then a short war, had hardened into something far more dangerous. The front lines barely moved, but the cost of holding them grew unbearable. Every month demanded more men, more shells, more sacrifice. Governments stopped asking whether the war could be won and began asking only how it could be endured. The battlefield had frozen, but history had not. In the trenches of France and Belgium, soldiers learned the true rhythm of industrial war. Days were measured not by progress, but by survival. Mud filled boots and lungs. Lice crawled through uniforms. The dead were buried hastily, often beneath the very ground that would soon be shelled again. Artillery became the true master of the battlefield. Shells fell day and night, tearing the earth apart, collapsing trenches and shattering nerves.
Men broke down without visible wounds.
They shook, screamed, or went silent, staring into nothing. At first, commanders called it cowardice. Later, it would be known as shell shock. Attacks followed a grim pattern. Days of bombardment, whistles blown. Men climbing ladders into machine gun fire. Ground gained in yards, lost in hours. Victory was counted in body bags. Yet generals persisted. They believed that one more push, one more sacrifice, would break the enemy. They did not yet understand that both sides were locked into the same logic, feeding men into a system designed to destroy them. Meanwhile, far from the Western Front, the war was spreading. In the East, Russia struggled under the weight of its own size. Poor logistics, weak leadership, and outdated equipment cost the Russian army dearly. Entire units were encircled and destroyed.
Soldiers marched baref out.
Rifles were shared between men, one firing while the other waited for him to fall. The human cost was staggering. Civilians suffered alongside soldiers. As armies moved back and forth, towns were burned, crops destroyed, and populations displaced. Fear turned neighbor against neighbor. Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, and other minorities were accused of betrayal and punished collectively. Pogroms erupted.
The war poisoned everything it touched.
By 1915, it was clear that this conflict would not remain confined to Europe. The empires at war stretched across the globe, and so did their battlefields. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, long called the sick man of Europe, entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Its leaders hoped to reclaim lost prestige and territory. Instead, they opened new fronts across deserts, mountains, and ancient cities. In the Caucasus, Ottoman and Russian forces clashed in brutal winter conditions. Tens of thousands froze to death.
Logistics failed.
Retreat became catastrophe. And within the Ottoman Empire, fear turned inward. Convinced that Armenian populations posed a threat, Ottoman authorities ordered mass deportations. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the war. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians were driven from their homes. Many died of starvation, exposure, or outright massacre. Survivors carried trauma that would echo for generations. The war was no longer just about borders or power. It had become a war against civilians. At sea, another silent battle unfolded. German submarines, known as U-boats, prowled the Atlantic, targeting Allied shipping. Britain depended on imports to survive. Germany hoped to starve the island into submission. At first, U-boat warfare was limited. But as the stalemate dragged on, restraint vanished. Merchant ships were sunk without warning. Neutral vessels were hit. The ocean became a killing ground. When civilian liners were torpedoed, outrage followed.
But still, the war expanded.
Back in Europe, commanders searched desperately for a breakthrough. New weapons were introduced. Poison gas drifted across battlefields, choking men where they stood. Tanks crawled forward, terrifying but unreliable. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance tools into weapons of combat, dueling in the skies above the trenches. Technology advanced faster than ethics. Each innovation promised to end the war.
None did.
By 1916, pressure reached a breaking point. On the Western Front, Germany launched an offensive aimed not at capturing territory, but at bleeding France dry. The target was a symbol, a fortress city whose loss would be unthinkable.
Verdun.
The battle began in February and did not end until December. For 10 months, men fought over the same ground again and again. Villages vanished under shellfire. Hills changed hands dozens of times. French soldiers rotated through the front, but the psychological toll was immense. Verdun became synonymous with endurance, suffering, and futility. On the other side, British forces launched their own offensive along the Somme River. The goal was to relieve pressure on Verdun and break the German lines. On the first day alone, nearly 60,000 British soldiers became casualties. Entire units were wiped out in minutes. Men walked forward into machine gun fire because that was the plan. By nightfall, the Somme had not been broken. The pattern repeated across the fronts.
Enormous losses, minimal gains, no end in sight.
At home, societies began to crack. Food shortages spread.
Inflation soared.
Governments expanded control over daily life. Propaganda became relentless, shaping how people understood sacrifice and enemy alike. Dissent was no longer tolerated. In Russia, the strain became unbearable. Years of war had exposed the weakness of the Tsarist system. Food shortages hit cities hard. Soldiers lost faith in their leaders. In early 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd. They began over bread. They ended with revolution. Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. For the first time in centuries, Russia had no emperor. But the war did not stop. The new provisional government promised reform but kept Russia in the conflict.
Soldiers deserted in droves. Discipline collapsed. Authority evaporated.
Later that year, a second revolution would bring the Bolsheviks to power, determined to end Russia's involvement at any cost. Russia's exit from the war would reshape everything. Meanwhile, another great power hovered at the edge of the conflict. The United States had remained neutral, watching events from across the Atlantic. But German submarine warfare, combined with diplomatic miscalculations, steadily pushed American opinion toward intervention.
The war was pulling in the world.
By 1917, it was clear that this was no longer a European conflict sparked by an assassination. It was a global war consuming empires, economies, and societies whole. The old world order was dying in the trenches. And as one empire after another began to collapse under the strain, the war entered its final, most desperate phase. Because now, the question was no longer how to win. It was who would survive the end.
By 1917, the war had stripped away all illusions.
There was no romance left in it.
No belief in quick victory.
What remained was endurance, fear, and the quiet understanding that whatever emerged from this conflict would not resemble the world that had entered it. The assassination in Sarajevo now felt like a distant memory, but its consequences were everywhere. In the East, Russia's collapse transformed the balance of power. When the Bolsheviks seized control in November 1917, they moved quickly to fulfill their promise of peace. For them, survival of the revolution mattered more than imperial ambition. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany.
It was a brutal agreement.
Russia surrendered vast territories, including Ukraine and parts of the Baltics. Millions were removed from Russian control in exchange for an end to the war. Germany celebrated. For the first time, the Eastern Front was gone. German divisions were redeployed west. Commanders believed they finally had the advantage needed to break the stalemate before American forces could arrive in strength.
They were wrong.
Across the Atlantic, the United States was mobilizing at an unprecedented scale. What had begun as neutrality ended after repeated submarine attacks on civilian shipping and the revelation of diplomatic efforts to draw Mexico into war against America. In April 1917, the United States declared war. But American troops did not arrive overnight. Training, transport, and organization took time. For months, the war continued much as before, while German leaders watched the clock. In the spring of 1918, Germany made its final gamble. A massive offensive slammed into Allied lines. New infiltration tactics bypassed strongpoints and struck deep. For a moment, it seemed the front might collapse.
Paris came under artillery fire once more.
Civilians fled.
Panic spread.
But Germany had exhausted itself. Supply lines failed. Reinforcements lagged. The offensive outran its own logistics. And as American troops arrived in growing numbers, the balance shifted again. By summer, the initiative was gone. The Allies counterattacked with coordination and overwhelming material strength. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry moved together in ways unseen earlier in the war. German units fell back, no longer able to recover. Morale inside Germany collapsed. Food shortages worsened.
Strikes spread. Sailors mutinied. The promise of victory evaporated.
In November 1918, revolution erupted. The Kaiser abdicated and fled into exile. Germany's new government sued for peace. On November 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent.
The war was over.
But peace would prove more elusive than victory.
The battlefield had consumed empires.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved into a patchwork of new states. Borders were redrawn with rulers and pencils, often ignoring ethnic realities on the ground. Millions found themselves minorities overnight. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, its lands carved up under mandates and promises that would sow conflict for decades. The Middle East was reshaped by external powers with little understanding of local realities. Germany emerged defeated, humiliated, and blamed. At the peace conference in Paris, leaders spoke of justice and stability. But fear and revenge shaped the final agreements. Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the war, surrender territory, limit its military, and pay heavy reparations. Many warned that the terms were too harsh. They were ignored. For soldiers returning home, there was no triumph.
There was silence.
Entire generations had been broken. Millions were dead. Millions more were wounded, physically and psychologically. Civilians struggled to rebuild lives amid inflation, shortages, and grief. Women who had taken on new roles during the war were pushed back into old ones. Veterans found themselves alienated in societies eager to forget. The world that emerged from the war was unstable, resentful, and armed with new ideas. Nationalism had not been destroyed. It had been intensified. Revolution had not been contained.
It had spread.
Technology had not been tamed.
It had been unleashed.
All of it traced back, in one way or another, to that June morning in Sarajevo. The assassination did not cause every decision that followed, but it exposed how fragile the international system truly was, how alliances designed to prevent war could accelerate it, how leaders, bound by fear and pride, could stumble into catastrophe. The First World War was not inevitable. It was chosen, step by step, and its legacy would not end in 1918, because the peace that followed carried within it the seeds of another, even more destructive conflict.
A second war would come.
And when it did, the world would remember Sarajevo not just as the place where a man was killed, but where the modern age of total war truly began. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, Europe did not exhale in relief. It sagged. Cities were intact, but societies were fractured. Fields lay unworked. Railways were broken. Families waited at stations for men who would never return. The silence after the war felt unnatural, almost dangerous, as if the world itself was unsure what to do without the constant thunder of artillery. The First World War ended fighting. It did not end conflict. The peace that followed was shaped not only by victory, but by fear. Fear of collapse.
Fear of revolution.
Fear that if the defeated were not restrained, they would rise again. Those fears guided decisions more than reconciliation ever did. At the center of it all stood Germany. The new German Republic, born out of defeat, inherited a country exhausted and humiliated. Millions of veterans returned to a nation struggling to feed itself.
Inflation soared.
Political violence became routine. Many Germans did not believe they had truly lost the war. They believed they had been betrayed from within. This myth took hold quickly. The war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles became a lightning rod. It was not just a legal statement, it was a moral accusation. Germany was told it alone was responsible for the war that had destroyed Europe. For a population that had suffered blockade, hunger, and loss, this felt intolerable. Across cafes, barracks, and political meetings, resentment hardened into ideology. Elsewhere, the collapse of empires created new nations, but also new problems. In Eastern Europe, borders were drawn without fully resolving ethnic tensions. Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, and others struggled to define identities within fragile states. Minorities feared majorities. Old grievances resurfaced under new flags. The Balkans remained volatile. The very region where the war had begun was left unstable, burdened by competing national ambitions and unresolved questions of power. In Russia, the revolution that had ended the country's participation in the war sparked a civil conflict even bloodier than the fighting on the front. Millions died as the new Soviet state consolidated power. The world watched with alarm as a radically different political system emerged from the ruins of empire. Western leaders hoped distance would contain it. They were mistaken. The war had also changed how people thought about violence. Before 1914, war had been brutal but limited. After 1918, mass death had become normalized. Entire societies had been mobilized, trained, and conditioned to accept enormous losses for abstract goals. This was a dangerous inheritance. Children grew up hearing stories of trenches and sacrifice. Veterans carried trauma that words could not fully express.
Some turned inward.
Others searched for meaning in nationalism, extremism, or revolution. The war had broken the belief that progress was inevitable. It had shattered faith in old institutions. Churches, monarchies, and liberal governments all emerged weakened. In the vacuum, radical movements flourished. Fascism rose in Italy, promising order and national rebirth. In Germany, extremist groups exploited anger and despair. Across Europe, democracy struggled to survive in societies scarred by loss. And always in the background was the memory of how easily it had all begun.
A visit, a parade, a wrong turn, 4 gunshots.
Historians would later argue endlessly about responsibility,
about alliances, about militarism.
about nationalism and imperial decline. All of them were correct. But what the assassination in Sarajevo truly revealed was something deeper. It revealed how modern systems amplify small actions. A single act of violence, committed by a young man convinced he was striking a blow for freedom, triggered mechanisms far beyond his understanding.
Diplomatic protocols, military timetables, alliance obligations, political fears.
None of these could be stopped once they began to move. The leaders of 1914 were not ignorant.
They were not all fools.
Many believed they were acting rationally, even defensively. Yet together, they created a catastrophe none of them fully intended. That is the enduring lesson of the assassination. Not that one man caused a world war, but that the world was already prepared to destroy itself. The First World War did not just reshape borders. It reshaped how humanity understood power, violence, and responsibility. It marked the point where industrial capacity and political ideology fused into something far more destructive than any previous conflict. And it left unfinished business. The war ended in 1918.
Its consequences did not.
Just 21 years later, Europe would once again descend into chaos. The resentments left unresolved, the ideologies radicalized, the lessons misunderstood, all returned with even greater force. The Second World War would dwarf the first in scale and destruction. And when it came, historians would trace its roots back through the trenches, the treaties, and the bitter peace.
All the way back to Sarajevo, to a quiet morning, to an open car,
to a moment when the future could still have gone another way.
But did not.